So what do people mean when they say they want to tell a story when playing a tabletop game? You hear this often in the role-playing game space where everyone is excited to tell the story of their character, but it's also something you hear in the tabletop wargaming space too. Everyone in both spaces has huge aspirations of telling and being a part of an epic tale, driven by their choices at the table. They want to tell a story. Their story. I was thinking about this concept recently and perhaps cynically wondered why this was. Games have to have stories that don't have clean, succinct, no-frills narratives, the kind of stories that we've become accustomed to these days. Most screenwriting books will push you in this direction, to cut the cruft, come in late, and get out early. Don't let a story meander, make sure that everything that happens has a narrative, world building, and character consequence. That's possible when writing those stories because as an author, you have full control over the narrative and the power to go back and edit what happened. With tabletop, though, every decision you make is immediately canon in the story, whether it makes sense narratively or not. Every role decides the direction of the story, whether it's dramatic and leads to a satisfying conclusion or not. This leads to storytelling that is unexpected, filled with twists and turns that are at times dramatic and interesting, and at other times nonsensical and anticlimactic. Now, here's the question. Does the fact that most people aren't professionals mean that their stories are going to be below the standard of more refined stories told by professionals? And as a follow-up to that, if that is true, why would anyone even bother to try it? Well, I'd address both questions by answering the first one. Games, by their very nature, do not conform to the tight Hollywood narrative, because that narrative can't sustain itself if the story starts taking unexpected turns. It reminds me of that old video essay on YouTube, The Shandification of Fallout. In the video, the essayist talks about the wandering narratives of an old book called The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, where one of the central jokes is that the narrator just can't explain anything simply, but has to go off in these wild tangents to add context to the tale. The essayist makes the point that the narrative of New Vegas leans into the medium of games, setting up a central narrative that lends itself to a game where player choices and meandering support the story rather than taking away from it. Meanwhile, any detours taken in the mainline Fallout games or Skyrim feel like diversions from the central narrative, where the player has to suspend disbelief that the story isn't carrying on without them, rather than the diversions being a part of the story. Now, this concept is true for tabletop games too, because the narrative can't be wrestled into line due to chance and player choices, so the narrative must conform to the medium where it lives. Now, this has to result in an unfocused narrative, but not necessarily a worse one. I don't think that just because we're more used to the focused narratives of Hollywood, that's automatically what everyone wants from all of their stories. Those focused narratives really are just a product of their medium, since they have to tell stories that fit within a 2-hour movie-going experience. But if you look at TV, especially serialized television, you can see that meandering narrative is how they stay alive. How I Met Your Mother, for instance, is a show that, at least on the surface, is about a dad telling his kids how he met their mother. But as the years and 9 seasons pass with the show barely touching the central question, we can see that the question itself is merely a MacGuffin to hook the audience into a story about 5 idiots in New York in a world where the title of Friends was already taken. The story was never really about the main character finding his wife. It was about him finding himself. Which is why the show meandered around for 9 seasons, showing us every mistake he made and lesson he learned. With gaming stories, it's not like we want to forge some new area of humanity left unexplored. It's more important to tell a story that's very meaningful to you, because then it will be meaningful to others. And even if it's not, or you don't have the means of transmitting that story to others, if that story meant something to you, that's enough, because you matter too. And one of the things about gaming that I think is so important, as opposed to the mediums of film and TV, is it is a space that's fully owned by the people playing it. So if there's something that is hard to explore on TV, or there are powers that be that prevent that thing from being explored, that's why stories explored on the table matter even more. If you do find a way to share the stories that mean a lot to you, I consider that a loving act, because you are gifting the world with something that was valuable and meaningful to you. Does that mean that every story you make is going to be good or consumable by a large audience? No. Most of them will be bad or generic or a mix of the two, It doesn't matter though. If your goal is to tell stories that resonate with others, that is a learned task that takes a lot of trial and effort to perfect. But a game with your friends? You don't need to explain why that was special. It was shared in your heads and your hearts like it happened in real life. Because it did. You may not have actually slayed a dragon after sacrificing yourself to save your friends, but in the story you told together, the characters you made had that experience, and you all got to watch that movie, read that book, played that game together. It's as real as any story you've ever seen on page or screen, and even more so because you built it with your friends. And what an absolute gift that is to give another human being. And I really think that we should all, myself included, practice not taking that for granted. Now, with all that said, I think it's pretty obvious how storytelling functions in TTRPGs like Dungeons & Dragons. But how about story in tabletop wargames? I've spoken before about how wargamers all crave an epic campaign that gives context to their battles and tells a story from one skirmish to the next. The thing I've often wondered is why it's so difficult to organize a wargaming campaign over something like a D&D campaign. In D&D, playing a campaign is the default, while in wargaming, a campaign is almost an anomaly, a holy grail, something that most only aspire to. But why is that? In D&D, you often have to battle over 5 people's schedule to get them all on the table at the same time, but in wargames, you often only need 2 people at the table at a time. So why is it harder? I'd put this down to 2 things: barrier to entry and overall game design. The first problem, barrier to entry, is the fact that in order to play a tabletop wargame, the players both need to have built and painted an army or warband ready for the game, as well as have an understanding of whatever rule set that you're using for this experience. That's already way more pressure on a player than D&D asks, which is often nothing more than a character sheet and maybe a painted miniature. Besides that, the rules are going to be the same from one D&D game to the next, and that's definitely not going to be the case for most wargames. Wargamers will often pick a completely different rule set for their game, depending on the setting, which they are expected to read and understand by game time. It's a lot to ask, especially when you consider that many D&D players barely know the rules to the one game they play, and often rely on the DM or other players to help them along. And that's not a bad thing. I'm really not knocking that at all. It's actually a huge strength of D&D, that it's functional when some players aren't that familiar with the rules. And that's the exact thing that I think wargamers should try to adopt for their hobby. If you have a vision for a wargame you want to play, removing any and all barriers to entry for those who want to play with you is key. D&D players often start with whatever they have lying around instead of fancy terrain and well-painted miniatures. It's only after the game gets its hooks into them that they'll jump in and start getting dice and miniatures and start reading the books. Often I run D&D for people who've never cracked the player's handbook before, and that's fine. I can give them pre-generated sheets or help them quickly make a character, and we jump right into the fun. I recommend a similar approach to wargaming. Pick a game that works with what you have around. Print player aids for everyone and just jump right in, coaching everyone as you go. This obviously won't result in the most strategically rewarding experience, but what it will do is get you telling a story with people who otherwise might never have tried if you said they needed to get a fully painted warband and read a book before jumping in. The other part is game design. You need to pick a system that is simple. You don't want a campaign that is incredibly realistic, makes everyone track supply lines and troop morale. No, those can be cool mechanics, but they can also be things you save for next time when everyone is already hooked into the game. You can literally lift mechanics from games like Risk for map design and movement. You could steal Catan's map generation mechanic. You could steal War of the Rings dice mechanic for deciding actions on a turn, which is a great way to reduce analysis paralysis. Once those mechanics are in, you should leave room in the game design for roleplay to have a mechanical effect. Let players wheel and deal and come up with creative solutions. Now, all this does require you to be the referee instead of one of the main players vying for control of the board. That doesn't mean you can't be playing to some extent. You could play as an NPC nation, fighting on their behalf if the players ever want to bring the fight to them. It's just that you aren't trying to make those NPC nations win. Now, here's the hard part. Say you realize how wonderful an experience shared storytelling through play can be, but you're having trouble getting started. Well, let me help you there. If you have trouble finding a group, I get it, but I think people might be overestimating the difficulty. You really only need one other person for a head-to-head wargame, and 3 to 4 for a more wide-reaching one. To find others who might be into the same hobby, the first step is testing the waters and getting to know people in your area. Go to local game shops and see what's happening. They often have Facebook groups and Discords you can hang out in and pitch your game idea. There also might be local game clubs. Get plugged into the scene or get creating that scene yourself. You only need 2 people to start a club. Get one friend and start there. You could also try to find a game online and play through Tabletop Simulator. Or you could get into solo war games. You can pick up this Solo Wargaming guide on Amazon for like 15 bucks roundabouts, maybe less, something like that. There's also a few YouTube channels I really like. One is The Joy of Wargaming on YouTube. The other one is Basement 1908, Dice Chatter, and the latter of which has some of the most high quality battle reports I've ever seen, so definitely check them out. I say all of this because I think gaming and storytelling is so much fun, and I think there are so many things people think are standing in their way, and I think the real thing I'd love to drill into you is people are only going to hesitate about jumping into something when they think it's a huge commitment, or maybe your idea isn't super locked in when you pitch it to them. Just come into a group with, this is something I would like to play, any volunteers to play it with me, remove all barriers to entry to them playing. If they want to play, make sure they don't need anything to come and play with you, just the time. And I think you'll see that it'll be a lot easier to find people than you would have realized. And if it's still super difficult, solo wargaming is really fun, and so is online wargaming. And so I wish you the most luck in bringing your stories to life with other people, or yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks so much to my patrons for helping support the content I'm bringing to you. I'm Ben DeHart, and if you like this video, subscribe and come back and catch the next one. And if you have any advice to people like me looking to get more storytelling from their gaming, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. See ya.